it can be extrapolated to our time and to any of the various particular things that are going on today, and that's a very important thing to think about.
Even the Lincoln assassination, which I mentioned, I mean, that's a story that's 150 years old. That 99.9% of the American people know almost nothing about that, other than that John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in Ford's Theater or whatever, and it's amazing how many aspects of that story are directly relatable to what's going on now with our government, and the kind of lies that we're told, and the kind of things that were going on the periphery, sort of that assassination. The parallels to today are they're astounding in some cases. I mean, like the guy that supposedly shot John Wilkes Booth, for example, which I don't believe that he actually did, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, this guy Boston Corbett, Sergeant Boston Corbett, he's the guy he's sort of the Jack Ruby of the Lincoln assassination. He's the guy that was on the posse, the special military detachment that was sent out to bring Booth back alive to stand trial, and against standing orders, he's the guy that supposedly shot and killed John Wilkes Booth, thereby circumventing a trial and all that good stuff. A very Jack Ruby-ish move, to say the least. But the interesting thing about this guy is that many years later, he showed up in, I believe it was Kentucky. He got a job as like the doorman of the Kentucky State Legislature, and a couple weeks later, the dude shows up to work brandishing 2 handguns and shot the place up. Now, when does that ever happen today? All the time.
Yes, it does.
Whether it's a school or a post office or a military base or Virginia Tech or, whatever it is, or, Jared Lee Lochner supposedly, showing up at, whatever it is, that happens all the time now. But it was astounding to me to find out that it happened back in like 1873 or 1888, or I don't remember the date off the top of my head, but sometime after the assassination, this guy who played a key role in that, and who also had a history of reporting that he heard voices in his head, and various other things that would tend to indicate some kind of mind control going on, even though according to most people that sort of thing didn't even exist until like post World War II, which I don't think is the case at all. But anyway, here you have this guy who was a key player in the Lincoln assassination, who years later, who walks around hearing voices in his head, and then something triggers him years later, and he shows up at the legislature and starts shooting up the place. So
that's amazing.
It's astounding that the more things change, the more they say the same, as they say, and it's just amazing how much hasn't changed, in 150 years, which is why that story is like my current obsession now, and I've been delving ever deeper into that rabbit hole. But anyway, that's kind of a little off topic. But anyway,
well, that's fine.
The point being that yeah, I mean, even you find these direct parallels no matter where you look, and even if you go back 150 years, so
yes. And yeah, I'm with you as far as mind control goes, Dave. There's a very old case involving a guy called James Matthew Tilley, I think his name was. He's the guy of the Heirloom Gang, if that rings a bell with you. As a guy who lived in England, he said there was a group of people called the Heirloom Gang who were using a device called the Heirloom, which was sending waves into his head to make him go crazy. And it involved a couple of relatively prominent people in the town or city that he lived in, and that was back in the earlier 1800s, I believe. Now, it could be that he was just crazy. Certainly entirely possible that he was just completely nuts. But the fact that he had come up with this grand scenario involving this gang of people who were operating a device that he took pains to describe and actually like sketched it out for the people who were supposedly treating him, or there wasn't really much treatment back at that time. They pretty much just locked you up. But, the stories of people influencing people's minds certainly go back beyond the 1950s. And
I think the basics of mind control have been known and sort of passed down through these, occult-based, quote-unquote, Masonic, whatever you want to call them, secret societies.
Mm-hmm.
And through families, through multi-generational, occult families. I think this stuff has been passed down for a long time, and I think what the MK Ultra project and all of its sub-projects that began, like in the 50s or whatever, that everybody points to as kind of the beginning of this, I think that was more about sort of refining and quantifying the methods that were already known, and just as importantly, I think one of the key goals was to sort of expand it to like a kind of a society on a society-wide level, to sort of inflict trauma-based mind control on the entire population. And
yes.
I believe that the Kennedy assassination was, at least in part, sort of a countrywide MK Ultra project. It was a trauma-based, it was an effort to traumatize, to inflict mass trauma on the entire country.
I agree with you.
Thereby affect a change in direction,
I absolutely agree with that.
A lot of what we see today is direct outgrowths of those efforts to study ways to sort of expand this into a more society-wide thing, and the whole notion of like serial killers and spree killers and now terrorists, and it's just a means of constantly keeping the people in fear and constantly traumatizing the people to affect the changes that they want to affect, and it's become more and more prominent. It's almost become now where there's like no recovery time, It's like they almost want to keep us, permanently traumatized. You barely recover from one thing, and it's on to something else,
That's true. And I agree with you 100% on the Kennedy assassination. I do view it that way. I think it is, partially at least, certainly part of what happened there. That, especially being assassinated the way he was, and the various films of it and everything that have been shown time and time again, and all of that was part of it.
It did not have to be done that publicly and filmed and replayed for 50 years.
Yeah,
still going. It was done very publicly and very. I think that I kind of thought that Obama was being set up the same way, to be honest with you. To me, looking back on it, I was only like 3 years old when Kennedy was assassinated, so it's not something that I have like a lot of personal recollections of. But looking back on it, it seems like to me like the people were really sort of encouraged to just idolize this guy, and almost like and when he was killed, to a lot of people it was almost like a family member had died, and the whole country really was very much in mourning, for quite a while, and we're very traumatized by it, and one of my fears was that Obama was kind of being set up for the same thing. He sort of kind of took the office as with all this sort of hero worship, and he was young and idealistic and to traumatize the nation.
Yes, I agree. I agree that as being a part of it. But since you mentioned mind control, I wondered if we could just touch on the Apollo stuff for a minute. Now, it's quite clear, obviously, I've looked at the Apollo missions myself pretty in-depth over the years and read many books on it. But I really appreciate the way you put together your material. And as I said, I really love the sarcasm that you have in your writing, because I mean, it deserves it. It deserves it.
Yeah, I think I always write with a heavy dose of sarcasm. I always try to throw some humor in, even in the serial killer book, which is very, very dark. There's occasional humor, although not nearly as much as in some of my other writing, because it's just such a dark and grim subject. But for the most part, I always try to inject as much humor into my writing as I can, on the principle that what was it, Mary Poppins thing of spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, or something.
There you go.
But so yeah, but the Apollo one, I think really sort of brought out much more of that than normal, just because to me it's just so ridiculous. I mean,
it is.
You know, after looking into it, I mean, it's almost kind of like the adult version of believing in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. I mean, it's so absurd to me.
Especially in the ensuing decades, and the way you point out the fact that the various proposals that have come forward since that time by NASA as efforts to like go back to the moon and things like this, and they're going on and on about how it will take us 20 years to be able to do that, and as you pointed out, there were 3 additional missions ready to go. They had the rockets all ready, the lunar modules all ready, and the crews all ready. 3 more missions ready to go to the moon after they stopped going, and all of a sudden now with all of our advanced technology. We can't possibly do that for decades. It would require all incredible work.
Have always problem. Yeah, it's just, why don't you roll one of those Saturn V's out and fuel it up? You know, they work just fine. Why reinvent the wheel? Yeah, but it amazes me that every time an announcement comes out about some new highfalutin plan that NASA has, it invariably directly contradicts the notion that we've already been there. Well, we can do this, but it's gonna take 20 years of research and development, and we still have to solve the radiation problem. We still have to solve the reentry problem. We don't know how to deal with the lunar dust, and wait a minute. How come we knew all that 40 years? And none of the reporters ever say a damn thing. It's like, how come nobody ever sticks up their hand and says, excuse me, can't we use the technology we had back in 1969? I mean, it amazes me that everyone just blindly accepts these pronouncements without having any realization, apparently, that they're contradicting themselves in these statements. It's
I know. It's almost like they want you to believe that everybody who had anything to do with that was all like just knowledge that they had. They're all dead now. We can't reconstruct it, and that technology was just so incredibly advanced. And I encourage anybody who's not seen, if I could just for a second, if anybody who has not read your Wagging the Moondoggie series, definitely go and check it out. But if you do nothing else, have a look at the close-up photographs of the lunar module, okay? And you tell me if we have the technology to put together something like that, because this thing supposedly landed on the moon, and it looks like something a bunch of kids threw together as sort of like a backyard kind of like shack for them to hang out in.
It does. It looks like somebody put it together to make some kind of hokey YouTube video or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It's astounding, and we're supposed to believe that these things not only landed on the moon, but then took off from the moon, completely untested. It's never been done before or since. It couldn't be tested because we don't have those conditions here to test it. And when it was supposedly tested here, they couldn't even get the thing to work right in Earth's atmosphere, where we know the known conditions. But supposedly they took them up there and they worked flawlessly every time. And I mean, there's just so many things about the story that are almost just, well, they are just laughable, if subjected to any kind of scrutiny, and yet they defend that. Well, NASA doesn't really so much defend it themselves. They have these various people, debunkers out there that they claim aren't really connected to them, but they obviously are, because NASA pretty much defers to them and lets them do all of their debunking. And my theory, as I stated in the thing, is the reason that they do that is because they know that the debunking arguments have no scientific validity, and they don't want to, they don't want to go on record as standing behind stuff that's obviously bad science, but yet they want to, deflect the critics, so they just sort of defer to these unofficial, debunkers. But they will viciously attack anyone that questions Apollo. I mean, holy shit, they opened up this whole discussion forum while I was posting the articles, and it ran to I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of posts from all of these debunkers that were just fretting over all these things that I was saying. It's a paper thin story. I mean, if you really look at it, I honestly don't know how anybody that's really looked into it could believe it. It's just so ridiculous, for so many reasons.
Yeah, well, as far as pointing out all of the ludicrous nature of it, the Wagging the Mood Doggy series is very good for doing that. But when I segued into this subject, we were talking about mind control, and there are two aspects to this that I wanted to ask you about. One is the astronauts themselves. I mean, there's been speculation by others that the astronauts had been subjected to some kind of mind control to make them actually think that they were on the moon at some point in time. And then the other thing is the idea of this entire spectacle being another sort of level of nationwide propaganda or mind control effort in some regard. What are your thoughts on that?
As far as the astronauts, I think that's quite possible. I've never seen any definitive proof, but then again, very unlikely that any evidence in that regard would ever be available. Mm-hmm. But I think that's highly likely that they could very well have been. I mean, they may very well have put them through the motions of sort of doing a mock landing and through various techniques, convince them that it was real. It's possible. I don't know. It's hard to say. They definitely seem very, very uncomfortable. And I don't know if you've ever seen on YouTube the initial press conference they did after they kept them in seclusion for a couple of weeks. They rolled them out, Aldrin and Armstrong and Collins, and had this press conference, and they sure seemed uncomfortable and nervous. I mean, they looked very much like they were thinking, can we really sell this? I mean, are they really expecting us to sell this story to the people? And I don't know. It's hard to say. It's hard to say how their silence was secured, so to speak.
Well, it's interesting to note that Armstrong has pretty much been almost totally incommunicado, and of course,
he just really became a recluse and doesn't do interviews. And Aldrin for a while became a raging drunk, and now he seems to be getting out there all over the place. And Collins he just sort of drifted off into obscurity, I think. Him being the one of the three that didn't supposedly get a land on the moon. And all three of them seem to have had some serious adjustment problems afterwards. And is that due to a guilty conscience? Is it due to the fact that their minds have been screwed with? It's hard to say.
So then, with all of the various things that you've pointed out, the technology and the things it's just quite astounding that all of these things being untested, and they go to the moon and they land there, and they come back safe with all their equipment and the moon rocks and all the other things that they have, and totally untested, and everything works flawlessly except for Apollo 13. But that could be another story all to itself. What do you believe? What do you believe is the ultimate purpose behind the Apollo program, as it were, taking it as a totally made up scenario? What is it that they were trying to accomplish with the charade that they were playing?
Multiple goals being pursued. I think one was definitely to distract from the wildly unpopular Vietnam War. And if you look at the timing of the launch of these, which is one thing I do in the series, is go through and point out how closely the launches correlated with like key revelations coming out of the war that they wanted to distract attention away from, and just the war in general and the unpopularity of it, and to sort of boost Nixon's poll ratings and sort of generate this kind of rally around the flag phenomenon, and just build some national spirit and all that sort of stuff. I think that was probably a goal, almost for sure a goal. I think also that the project probably had a lot more to do with pursuing military goals than pursuing space flight. I think it was kind of really sort of the early days of the whole Star Wars kind of notion, and sort of taking baby steps towards the militarization of space. And I think that's where a lot of that money actually went. And, under cover of this sort of civilian feel-good project, it was actually the beginnings of militarizing space. So I think those were probably two of the key goals, and there could very well have been others, but I think those were definitely two of the goals that were being pursued.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that the military aspects of it. Especially when you look at the technology that's being used there. Like we noted, the lunar module itself looks like something a bunch of kids built. It literally looks like someone just like stapled up like cardboard to the side of the thing, and it's got all this foil on there. You don't even know what's underneath that.
Yeah, the walls of the thing are like made of mylar or something. It's like a couple mils thick or something. They actually said they had to be careful when they were working on it, because if they like dropped a tool, it would go right through the bottom of the.
Yeah, and this is supposed to.
And yet this is sent out into the vacuum of space, where all it would take was a pinhole, and you're instantly dead.
Yeah, and of course
you're gonna travel for 10 days or what? You're gonna travel around in this thing where one misplaced elbow means like instant death, or one meteoroid, or one, anything. It's just, the whole thing is just absurd. And you mentioned being untested, and in fact, one of the most amazing things that I discovered was that the liftoff engine for the lunar module, the engine that supposedly took them off the moon, not only were never tested, they were never even fired up, because the fuel was so corrosive that they could only be burned once, and then they were no good anymore. The whole engine had to be rebuilt. So they built these things in the factory without even, supposedly just built them, installed them without even test firing them, and sent them up on the assumption that they were going to fire up the first time and get them off the moon. Who is going to do that? That's just insane to even think that they would have actually done that, and then to have them work flawlessly every single time. Now we can't even build a space shuttle that they can launch without blowing it up. But, back then we could send untested engines to the moon, and they fired up first time every time,
And as you pointed out, too, apparently back then they had muscle spaceships.
We got there a lot faster then, too. Yeah, now they're saying it's going to take a lot longer to... the arrogance faking it is just mind-boggling. You know, I mean, they must have presumably they must have thought at the time, well, at some point in the future, we're actually going to be able to do this. You know, so we'll just make it as accurate as possible based on what we know now, and you know, it'll fit in later or whatever. You know, but now here we are, you know, what, 50, 40 some years later, and nobody's ever come close to duplicating it. And if they ever do, it's going to be so completely different, you know. In every aspect of the mission is going to be just so completely different than the way. That's one reason that even if we had the technological capability to actually do it now, I don't know that they would want to, because it would be so far removed, you know, in any film they shot there or any pictures, or, you know, everything would be so completely different than what was previously sold, you know, to the American people, that they almost really can't do it again. Even, you know, I mean, even if we had the technology, which we don't, I don't know that they could ever do it again, you know, or maybe with enough passage of time that people forget or something. And you know, I don't know. You know, how long can you sell that story? That's one of the things I point out. You know, what if another 50 years go by and we, you know, I mean, after 100 years, are people, are then they going to wake up? Or are they going to look back and go, how the hell did we do that back then? You know, with the technology we had.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, our advanced technology
that story has a certain shelf life, that it can't live on forever without ever being duplicated. You know. So it was a pretty arrogant move to fake it, and at some point you would think it's going to come back and bite them in the butt, but you know, who knows? They have the ability to sell almost anything to the American people these days, it seems. So
yeah, and we're seeing a lot of that right now, especially. You know, I see it every day. I see.
Yeah, I mean, I see stuff all the time that I think, well, maybe this will finally be the straw that broke the camel's back, because there's no way anybody's going to believe this. But they do. And then you're time after time after time.
And then you're disappointed yet again, like I am, that people are not like shouting out their windows, "Wait a minute, this is bull crap. I ain't buying this." But yet people...
Yeah, I mean, I read stuff in the paper every day that just leaves me shaking my head going, really? There's... Okay, well, you know, I guess people are buying it, but... Yeah, I mean, that's... you know, from the point of view of the powers that be, I mean, that's the beauty of the American system, is that they've built this just incredibly effective propaganda machine, coupled with the indoctrinated belief that, you know, the vast majority of Americans have, that you know, we're kind of special over here, and unlike other countries, we don't have to question our media and our government, and you know, we can be safe that we've got this free and fair media, and you know, they're keeping an eye on you know, and the Republicans are keeping an eye on the Democrats, and the Democrats are, you know, and blah blah blah. And we have all these checks and balances, and we don't really have to worry, because, you know, stuff like that doesn't happen here. But it does happen here.
Yes, it does.
Every single day.
It sure
does. But the people are, you know, they have done an excellent job of building this propaganda machine, and an excellent job of selling to the people the notion that, you know, we're special, and that we can follow different rules here than the rest of the world, you know. And
yes.
That's the beauty of this. I mean, these people aren't stupid, you know. They're very intelligent, and they've had a very, very long time to work. You know, they got a big head start on the rest of us that are trying to figure things out, you know. So,
yes, they do. So, and they got a lot of money and a lot of influence and a lot of power to do things that we just don't have at our disposal. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and that's another aspect too. Just one final note on the Apollo thing, and then we'll wrap up the show. I wanted to ask you if you had looked into any of the Masonic angles to the whole thing, like the timing and associated with like Masonic ritual, or the fact that I think all the astronauts, or if not all of them, practically all of them, were Masons. Have you ever like looked into that particular aspect of it?
Not really so much, no. I've actually had people tell me that despite, all the flaws in the story, that they believe that we did go there just because it has such strong either Masonic or occult symbolism, the whole notion of reaching the moon or something. But no, it's not something that I've really looked into much at all. No.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to give you a chance to comment on that if you had. Because
I know there's
of course,
one picture that I included that seems like staged with some, like sort of Masonic symbolism, where they took a picture of the flag supposedly on the moon, and the way that it's draped, it's sort of in a pyramid shape, and then the moon's right above it, so it kind of creates this symbolic version of the, all-seeing eye over the pyramid.
Ah, yes,
one of the
I recall.
photos, and that looked very deliberately staged that way to me. So there's that one aspect that I did stumble across. But beyond that, no, I haven't really looked into it in any depth at all. No.
Well, in any case, what you have put together is great, and anybody that's listening who has not read that, definitely go take a look at it. If for no other reason,
if you think I'm totally full of crap, you'll at least be entertained.
Oh my goodness, yeah, the writing is fantastic. If you like sarcasm, you got to read that, because it is just dripping with it, and rightfully so, because what he's pointing out is just so ludicrous whenever you look at it. It's just ridiculous, and then, like I said, it doesn't even matter if you believe we went to the moon or not. It's a great story to read, so check it out. And also inside the LC, and I'll remind you again that Dave's website is davesweb.cnchost.com. That's davesweb.cnchost.com. And you can find Inside the LC there, and you can also find Wagging the Moon Doggy. And presumably sometime in the future, we're going to have a new series on Lincoln, which sounds really fascinating. And of course, don't forget that Dave does have 3 books that he put out, as I mentioned earlier. It's Programmed to Kill.
Out of print. The Railing Democracy is actually out of print, but the other 2 are still currently available.
Actually, on Amazon, Derailing Democracy, they do have some for sale.
Really?
Yes, they do.
Well, never mind then. Last I heard it was out of print, but maybe they're, I don't know, I guess maybe they still... all right, never mind then.
Well,
carry on.
They got some anyway. Yeah, so... the 3 books and the website also. And is the Lincoln thing what you're primarily doing right now, or if not, what are you working on right now?
That has been that's been my primary area of new research. That's what I've been doing spending all of my research time on. And as far as writing, I just did a final chapter on Moondoggy, which was posted a few weeks ago, and now I'm trying to finish up all of the loose ends, all of the leftover material I have on Laurel Canyon, and get that wrapped up, and then I will most likely venture into starting to write up all the Lincoln material, which is going to be another long multi-part series, most likely. So that's sort of my current orientation right now.
It sounds really good. I can't wait to see that. And the fact that the LC is going to continue as well. And you had noted that you still have a lot of material to put in there, and I think that's great, because it's something that we can always come back to, and because it's so voluminous. You can come back and read it again and again, because there's always going to be some little tidbit that you'll come up with on a second or third reading to ponder over that you maybe didn't notice the first time. And that's why I think that's another reason probably why it's so popular too, because there's just so much information there. When you come back and you look at it again, you say, hey, wait a minute, I don't remember reading that the first time, and then you look at it a little bit different and come up with some other conclusions and that lead you into some other different directions too. So
probably about it. Yeah, no, I think nothing else that immediately comes to mind now.
Okay. Well, that sounds great. Once again, Dave Mcgowan, everybody.
And scientific data. In these enlargements, it looks as though the lunar module was simply placed there, not even one speck of moon dust on the landing pod. As a result, all subsequent flights had to have the same discrepancy, which was explained away by the effect of no atmosphere. And what about stars? On the moon, with no atmosphere, they must have been quite a sight to behold. Yet there is seldom any mention of them, if ever, by any of the astronauts on any of the missions. Undoubtedly, creating a mural with all the constellations properly placed in the sky would have been virtually impossible to create accurately, much less realistically. A competent amateur astronomer would have been able to call attention to the slightest error in measurement. The answer? Not to talk about the stars, ever. In their post-flight press conference, it was the only question to which Neil Armstrong responded with an absence of memory.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Years later, though, Michael Collins would remember seeing the elusive stars and wrote about them in Expeditions to the Moon. It seems his memory improved the older he got. Why don't stars appear in any of the photographs? Simply because the proper, mostly closed exposure setting for the camera's iris, set that way to compensate for the bright sunlight on the moon's surface, completely diminished the faintness of relatively distant specks of diminutive light. This answer is true. It does not, however, explain why they never took any pictures of the stars by themselves, with an exposure setting perfect for them. While they took 3 automobiles to the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized. If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, they would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent. The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going? Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind, at least twice, on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity, must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts inside after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag, just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny. To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen colour television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution colour video camera with them on their mission. Yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Perhaps this was precisely what NASA and the federal government had in mind. After all, it was a first, regardless of where they were. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven. And finally, the element that seals their fate. Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, one gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr. and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color, with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance, in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Furthermore, it is apparent they are in genuine zero gravity aboard the actual spacecraft, necessary to convince the mass media of their authenticity, just not any further than Earth orbit, as you will see. In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. We're coming in on Earth.
Again, the illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private, until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from entering through the other windows. Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form 2 different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with a TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue cast. See white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away? Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway. It thus confirms that the stumbling block to their success was the lethal radiation of the Van Allen radiation belts. Since the same equipment was used on the subsequent missions in the 40 months that followed, none of them could have gone to the moon. They only increased their proficiency at staging them. When some TV viewers of the second manned mission to the moon telephoned the networks complaining that reruns of I Love Lucy were being interrupted, it became clear that for the taxpayers, once was enough. But it wasn't enough for the government and contractors. Billions of dollars of pure profit went with each return. How coincidental that the following mission would have the element of life and death jeopardy. Apollo 13. Now the public would take going to the moon more seriously and be reconnected with the drama. We now realize that perhaps the reason Neil Armstrong has never given an on-camera interview is because he doesn't want to lie anymore. What threats may have been made upon such honorable men or their families to possess their reluctant cooperation and later ill feelings towards perpetuating this still darkened hour in American history? NASA's highest-ranking official, James Webb, resigned without explanation just days before the first Apollo mission. Why, when he was on the threshold of achieving the greatest accomplishment of his career? All three Apollo 11 astronauts also resigned shortly after their return. On the 25th anniversary of the event in 1994, Neil Armstrong made a rare public appearance and held back tears as he spoke these brief cryptic remarks before the next generation of taxpayers as they toured the White House.
Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you, we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
He is that layer. Perhaps someday soon, with the uncovering of this footage and its meaning, the true patriots of America will rise.
The methods that were already known, and just as importantly, I think one of the key goals was to sort of expand it to like a kind of a society on a society-wide level, you know, to sort of inflict trauma-based mind control on the entire population. And yes. I believe that the Kennedy assassination was at least in part, sort of a countrywide MK Ultra project. It was a trauma-based, it was an effort to traumatize, to inflict mass trauma on the entire country.
I agree with you.
Thereby affect a change in direction,
I absolutely agree with that.
A lot of what we see today is direct outgrowths of those efforts to study ways to sort of expand this into a more society-wide thing, and the whole notion of like serial killers and spree killers and now terrorists, and it's just a means of constantly keeping the people in fear and constantly traumatizing the people to affect the changes that they want to affect, and it's become more and more prominent. It's almost become now where there's like no recovery time, It's like they almost want to keep us, permanently traumatized. You barely recover from one thing, and it's on to something else,
That's true. And I agree with you 100% on the Kennedy assassination. I do, to make him go crazy. And it involves a couple of relatively prominent people in the town or city that he lived in, and that was back in the earlier 1800s, I believe. Now, it could be that he was just crazy, certainly entirely possible that he was just completely nuts, but the fact that he had come up with this grand scenario involving this gang of people who were operating a device that he took pains to describe and actually like sketched it out for the people who were supposedly treating him, or there wasn't really much treatment back at that time. They pretty much just locked you up. But, the stories of people influencing people's minds certainly go back beyond the 1950s. And
I think the basics of mind control have been known and sort of passed down through these, occult-based, quote-unquote, Masonic, whatever you want to call them, secret societies. And through families, through multi-generational, occult families. I think this stuff has been passed down for a long time, and I think what the MK Ultra project and all of its sub-projects that began, like in the 50s or whatever, that everybody points to as kind of the beginning of this, I think that was more about sort of refining and quantifying until, like post-World War II, which I don't think is the case at all. But anyway, here you have this guy who was a key player in the Lincoln assassination, who years later, who walks around hearing voices in his head, and then something triggers him years later, and he shows up at the legislature and starts shooting up the place. So
that's amazing.
It's astounding that the more things change, the more they stay the same, as they say, and it's just amazing how much hasn't changed, in 150 years, which is why that story is like my current obsession now, and I've been delving ever deeper into that rabbit hole. But anyway, that's kind of a little off topic. But anyway,
well, that's fine.
The point being that yeah, I mean, even you find these direct parallels no matter where you look, and even if you go back 150 years, so
yes. And yeah, I'm with you as far as mind control goes, Dave. There's a very old case involving a guy called James Matthew Tilley, I think his name was. He's the guy of the Heirloom Gang, if that rings a bell with you. As a guy who lived in England, he said there was a group of people called the Heirloom Gang who were using a device called the Heirloom, which was sending waves into his head. How it can be extrapolated to our time and to any of the various particular things that are going on today. And that's a very important thing to think about.
Even the Lincoln assassination, which I mentioned, I mean, that's a story that's 150 years old. That, I mean, 99.9% of the American people know almost nothing about that, other than that, you know, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in Ford's Theater or whatever, you know. And it's amazing how many aspects of that story are directly relatable to what's going on now with our government, and, you know, the kind of lies that were told, and the kind of things that were going on the periphery, sort of that assassination. The parallels to today are just, they're astounding in some cases. You know, I mean, like the guy that supposedly shot John Wilkes Booth, for example, which I don't believe that he actually did, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, this guy Boston Corbett, Sergeant Boston Corbett, he's the guy he's sort of the Jack Ruby of the Lincoln assassination. He's the guy that was on the posse, the special military detachment that was sent out to bring Booth back alive to stand trial, and against standing orders, he's the guy that supposedly shot and killed John Wilkes Booth, thereby circumventing a trial and, you know, all that good stuff. A very Jack Ruby-ish move, to say the least. But the interesting thing about this guy is that many years later, he showed up in, I believe it was Kentucky. He got a job as like the doorman of the Kentucky State Legislature, and a couple weeks later, the dude shows up to work brandishing 2 handguns and shot the place up. Now, when does that ever happen today? All the time.
Yes, you know? It does.
Whether it's a school or a post office or a military base or Virginia Tech or, you know, whatever it is, or, you know, Jared Lee Lochner supposedly, you know, showing up at, you know, whatever it is, that happens all the time now. But it was astounding to me to find out that it happened back in like 1873 or 1888, or I don't remember the date off the top of my head, but sometime after the assassination, this guy who played a key role in that, and who also had a history of reporting that he heard voices in his head, and, you know, various other things that would, you know, tend to indicate some kind of mind control going on, even though according to most people that sort of thing didn't even exist in